Hi, my name is Seth Fisher, also known as Crutch Rosé. And in today's episode of Rosé Rants and Reviews, we have our first bonus episode.
There we go.
No, for real.
Somewhere along those
Let's be honest, the only thing that you can say is welcome to Rosé Rants and Reviews. Hi, my name is Seth Fisher, also known as Crutch Rosé, and welcome to the first bonus episode of Rosé Rants and Reviews. Now, with this being a bonus episode, the duration and runtime of this episode is going to be 14 minutes compared to the average 7, as stated in the first episode of Rosé Rants and Reviews. I'm going to be going over a little bit of what I covered over the past 2 episodes, as well as some new material from Dragon Ball, and looking at it through a couple of different lenses that are important for what I'm trying to convey here today in this bonus episode. So, to start, I just want to say that there are 3 different aspects of culture that I am going to be looking at Dragon Ball through. Those aspects being the original culture and community that it was written for and by. Secondly, me as a First Nation Ojibwe person, how I consume this media and how I perceive the messages and lessons that are being conveyed. And thirdly, the similarities that lie between content creation and storytelling in Japanese and indigenous, specifically Ojibwe culture. Now, to move on to the other 3 topics that I would like to cover in this bonus episode, I want to talk about Dragon Ball's portrayal of the abuse of power, capitalism, etc., specifically pertaining to the Red Ribbon Army and Frieza. So I will be covering in this bonus episode the entirety of Dragon Ball, where anything is up for grabs here. Specifically, I will be looking at some certain characters, and I will be looking at through very specific lenses. It should be noted that I have drastically modified the approach that I am going to be taking for Rosé Rants and Reviews moving forward. I don't know if this has been mentioned, but as we're rolling into the 3-minute mark here, I want to start getting into the actual content. So I just want to say, if I haven't covered this at all yet, that Rosé Rants and Reviews is a media and communication podcast that was actually originally created as a university project for the class Creative Technologies 203. So, with that being said, there have been some altercations that I have had to make to the trajectory that I intended on taking this project to make it better fit the syllabus and the content that I am learning in the course, and I want to properly incorporate some of the things that I have learned and look at Dragon Ball through these unique lenses. So, without further ado, I want to start rolling into the first part that I want to cover, which is culture. Now, as I said, culture is going to be broken down into 3 separate points, but the original one that I want to talk about is Dragon Ball's original, sorry to sound redundant, culture that it was written in, which is a very, very unique circumstance because as I was talking about and will talk about with my consumption of media and how I personally indulged in Dragon Ball, which is Japanese culture, and then therefore perceived what I was reading in my own culture's lens. This is actually the exact same thing that happened with the original creator of Dragon Ball, Akira Toriyama, funny enough. Now, Akira Toriyama originally based Dragon Ball's opening chapters off of a Chinese mythological tale known as Journey to the West. I spoke about this in the previous episodes. Now, there's a lot of inspiration and a lot of character archetypes that made writing the story easier because it was based off of something initially. But it came into its own when Toriyama started injecting his own culture, his own beliefs, his own personality, but more than anything, the culture of the Japanese people into Dragon Ball. And Dragon Ball as a property is highly beloved by the Japanese in today's day and age and has been for the past 40 years. Toriyama, who has passed last year, was a wonderful mangaka and a revolutionary writer for manga, and he created one of the best animes of all time. The culture that Dragon Ball was originally written in was that of Toriyama's own life.
one that was based out of his fears, one that was based out of circumstantial things in history, all of which can be narrowed down to being the result of the region that he lived in as well as the culture that he was raised in. Now, the way that he chose to convey that culture through practicing of martial arts in his stories, mystical elements, and calls to Japanese culture and mythology, that is all easily digestible and convertible into many other cultures. Depending on who you are, you will perceive any story in a different lens, which is precisely what I am talking about in Rosé Rants and Reviews, not just in this episode, but in a grander scale. The covering of the entirety of Dragon Ball is an important part of my life, and it's something that I really want to properly convey, the way that it has affected me and how I have indulged this media and how it has drastically changed my life and been one of my largest inspirations for becoming a content creator and a comic book artist myself. And with that being said, I want to move on into the second part, which is the digestion of culture in my personal lens. Now, the themes of friendship and family and specifically deep rooted in bloodlines and things like that that lie within Dragon Ball are extremely relative to my own culture and some of the stories that I have heard growing up. Um, Stories about proud warriors and lineage and, taking up the mantle are all indigenous themes, the same as they are Japanese mythological cultural themes. So it was very easily digestible for me, at least, as a First Nation Ojibwe person, to digest and understand and give it new meaning for my own life. And beyond just taking lessons and giving it meaning to my own life, I was able to understand and give new meaning to these stories based on my own personal experiences and the cultural differences that I grew up with, which may have made me perceive certain scenes entirely differently, but gave them ultimately more emotional output for me personally. Now, as I move on to the comparisons between the two cultures, I have already covered a large amount of what I want to say there, but I just want to drive home the main fact that I strongly believe that there are traditional similarities between Japanese, or for a grander scope, Asian cultures, as well as Native American or indigenous cultures. Now, there is significant differences depending on tribes and things like that, but what I do want to say is that the core roots of family, um, working hard, being strong, pride, are all very, 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 very deep rooted in both of these respective cultures, which I think is what led to such a unique interpretation of the story from my aspect. Moving forward, I want to talk about the grander scale topics that convey deep political meaning in Dragon Ball. Specifically, as I was saying earlier, the abuse of power and the manipulation of media. Now, I can give three examples right off the top of my head, and I don't even have to think about them for what these could be. Um, in the King Piccolo saga, King Piccolo takes over the world. King Piccolo manipulates the media by taking over the world and then using his abuse of power to draw a lottery once a year, and every year he will destroy one of the capital cities and all of its inhabitants, killing everybody. Pretty dastardly and pretty evil, right? This is an abuse of power. Now, albeit in a little bit of a ridiculous sense, King Piccolo rose to power, he took over, and he controlled the media to fearmonger people to submitting to him, which is a very, very common thing that has happened historically with media, and I find it to be very interesting. Now, the parallels to political war do not end there in Dragon Ball. When we look at Lord Frieza from Dragon Ball Z in the Frieza and Namek saga, Toriyama spoke in his interviews how Frieza was composed of the worst things that he could ever think of, his biggest fears, and things that he had dealt with growing up. Now, specifically, what I'm talking about are his biggest fears of lizards and stuff. Now, that's not as relevant as his fear of loan sharks, which was a huge cultural problem in Japan and still is to this day during this time period. And Frieza being based on loan sharks, as well as history's most evil dictator, you know who I'm talking about, leads to Frieza being one of the most arguably evil characters written in all of fiction. Now, Frieza's abuse of power is shown by his dismissal and his execution of his own followers consistently. He is willing to do whatever it takes to get what he wants, and using his abuse of power, he manipulates people into submitting to him just as King Piccolo did, and then he will end their lives in an instant if they don't provide to him what is needed from him. Now, here's the thing. Dragon Ball is extremely hyperbolic with how it portrays these points, but they are still digestible if you just think about them. You just have to understand what is trying to be conveyed and look at it through your own lens. Try to take away something. And this isn't just with Dragon Ball, it's just because that is what this series is about. You can do this with any media, anything. And especially if you're creating your own media, I would strongly suggest doing this as you create your own media and trying to find ways that you can convey who you are, what you believe in, what you were raised to believe, and everything that's inspired you along the way into everything that you make moving forward. Now, there is about 3 minutes left in this episode, and I have one more topic pertaining to Dragon Ball I want to cover, and then I want to dive a little bit into a review as well as talk about me as a content creator and how I have been influenced. Now, specifically this last point that I want to talk about with Dragon Ball is actually its portrayal of Native Americans. During the Red Ribbon Army saga, Goku is introduced to two Native Americans by the names of Bora and his son Upa. Now, I won't get into the specifics of what happens with their characters, but I want to more so speak on how they are portrayed and how indigenous people, specifically this Karinga tribe which is introduced, are portrayed. Now, here's the thing with their portrayal, is it is completely inoffensive if you ask me. And Dragon Ball does have some offensive character caricatures. You know I'm talking about Mr. Popo. Regardless of what he was originally based on, that's not a good design. Now, however, in direct comparison, Bora and Upa are very well done characters, and I find them personally to be very respectful and a unique, really a unique thing in anime. I have not seen very many anime or manga that actually portray Native American or indigenous people, and I find it to be great that it was done. And again, I would like to reiterate that they were not offensively done. Now, Dragon Ball may have some offensive caricatures, like Mr. Popo, but Bora and Upa were done very tastefully, and they were directly tasked with something that pertains to what our culture is. We do the will of the Great Spirit. What they are tasked with doing is defending Korin's tower, which above it is Kami's lookout, which is basically God in this world. So, in a digestible way, they are tasked with defending the heavens, which is the same type of lessons that I was taught growing up and the same type of stories that I heard in my culture. I find that to be a very interesting comparison. We are actually going to be going a little bit over in this episode, but for this last minute, I do want to reiterate some of the stuff that I personally have been influenced by with Dragon Ball in my own content creation. Now, I've covered a lot of it throughout the duration of this episode, but the specifics that I want to talk about are how I have taken creating a protagonist and how I have taken making that protagonist into something more than just a protagonist. I want the characters that I create not to be characters, but rather to be lessons, to portray what I've learned in my life, each of them to fill a different task. And that is how I write. And if there's anything that I can say that I've taken away from Dragon Ball, it's my writing style, my indulgence style in how I consume media, and how I choose to portray the content that I put out going forward. Without further ado, and in conclusion, I just want to say that I would not be the content creator that I am had I not been introduced to a unique way of digesting and creating media thanks to Dragon Ball and Akira Toriyama. All right, I'll see you guys next episode.